The insult didn't come in private, it came in front of everyone. We were gathered in the VFW hall after my grandfather's funeral, the air heavy with coffee, carnations, and the low hum of voices trying to fill the silence. The folded flag and his medals sat in a shadow box at the front of the room, glowing under fluorescent lights. That's when my brother decided the moment belonged to him. He tapped the case with his knuckle, looked straight at me, and said loud enough for the whole hall to hear, "You're worthless. Always were." The chatter died instantly, forks froze above plates. I felt 100 eyes burn into me. My jaw clenched, but I didn't answer. Instead, I noticed the sharp hiss of the coffee urn, the faint tick of a brass pocket watch on the table, and the steady hum of the air conditioner pressing against the silence. Details, always details. That's how I survive. Because in that silence, the attorney stepped forward. He placed a heavy envelope on the table beside the watch. A red wax seal glowed under the lights, stamped with my grandfather's initials. Per his instructions, the attorney said, his voice calm but cutting through the room, "This letter is to be opened and read aloud by Captain Juarez." My brother smirked. He thought it was nothing. He had no idea what was about to happen. He had no idea that when I broke that seal, the noise he lived on would collapse under the weight of 4 pages of quiet, deliberate truth. What would you have done if you were me in that moment? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because this is the story of how a single letter ended the noise forever. I grew up in a house where every wall seemed to echo with orders, even when no one was speaking. My grandfather, Sergeant Major Alvarez, had retired from the Marine Corps long before I was born, but his presence never retired from our family. On Sunday mornings, while other kids were dragging themselves out of bed for cartoons, I was outside in the dew-soaked grass with him, watching as he raised the flag on the pole he'd cemented into our backyard. He insisted on perfect folds, no slack in the line, and salutes held with proper angles. Even as a child, I learned that details mattered. My brother Marcus was the golden boy of that world. He was built for it. Broad shoulders, natural speed, loud laugh. By the time he was 16, he could knock out 20 pull-ups without breaking a sweat, and my father bragged about it to anyone within earshot. By 20, he had enlisted, quickly moving into the infantry where every photo of him in uniform seemed to fuel the family's pride. He was their warrior, their proof that the Juarez bloodline still carried steel. Me? I was the opposite. Books, maps, quiet analysis. That was where I thrived. I wasn't weak, but I was never loud, never the type to pound my chest in a room full of Marines. When I commissioned later as an intelligence officer, the reactions at home were tepid at best. My father's first words weren't congratulations, but real Marines don't need spreadsheets. Marcus smirked, patting me on the back like I was his kid sister playing dress-up. "Try not to paper cut the enemy, Captain," he said once, loud enough for everyone to hear at Thanksgiving. The room laughed with him. I laughed too, but inside it burned. The only person who looked at me differently was Grandpa. He never raised his voice when Marcus strutted through the house in his camis, and he never dismissed me when I sat in silence with a book at the edge of the table. Instead, he'd tilt his head, motion for me to sit with him, and open the battered wooden box that held his medals and journals. His fingers, spotted with age but still steady, would guide me through yellowing pages of field notes, after-action reports he had written by hand. "Read this paragraph," he'd tell me, tapping a line where he'd recorded a patrol in Da Nang. "See how precise it is. No exaggeration, no wasted words. You don't need to shout when your documentation is clean. Paper speaks longer than voices." I helped him catalog his effects as he grew older. His discharge papers, the DD-214, lay carefully flattened under my hands as I scanned them. His ribbons, dulled by time, were logged in a spreadsheet he insisted I keep updated. I was the only one he trusted with that work. Not because I was strong, not because I was loud, but because I was meticulous. When Marcus caught wind of it, he rolled his eyes. "Figures. You were always Grandpa's secretary." I let the insult pass, because I'd already learned from the sergeant major. Silence often outlasts bravado. But it wasn't just paperwork. Grandpa had his rituals. Every night before taps played from the small clock radio on his dresser, he wound his pocket watch, a heavy brass piece, dented from years of use, engraved on the back with his service number and battalion. I asked him once why he cared so much about something so old. He smiled, placed the ticking watch in my palm and said, "This is more than time. This is proof I was there. When you hold it, you hold a ledger of where I've been. Remember when noise wins the room. Let documents win the day." I didn't realize then how much weight those words carried. At the time, they were just part of the quiet bond between us. The chess games at the kitchen table, the careful folding of flags, the late-night conversations where he taught me that strength wasn't always measured in pull-ups or loud orders. Sometimes it was measured in silence, in patience, in keeping the record straight. Marcus was the warrior everyone celebrated. I was the afterthought, the one who carried clipboards and maps. But to Grandpa, I wasn't worthless. I was the custodian of his story, even if no one else recognized it yet. By the time Marcus was a staff sergeant, his voice seemed to fill every room we shared. It didn't matter if it was a holiday dinner, a backyard barbecue, or a quiet family gathering after church. He had a way of steering conversations toward his own victories. If someone mentioned the weather, Marcus would recall a sandstorm he'd marched through in Helmand. If someone talked about work, he'd compare it to patrols under fire. People leaned in when he spoke, and he thrived on it. For me, it was different. I was always the one asked to grab the coffee, set up the chairs, or take the notes. The expectation followed me everywhere, even during family planning for Grandpa's memorial. In the group chat, Marcus had written, "You handle the logistics, finally something useful for you." Everyone else left it unchallenged, as though my value had been decided long ago. But outside the family bubble, there were moments when my work mattered, even if no one gave me the credit. I remembered a training exercise at Quantico. It was night, and our fire team had lost its compass after a river crossing. Panic spread quickly, but I looked up, found the North Star, and quietly directed us back toward the rendezvous. We arrived on time. The others never spoke of it, but I noticed how they glanced at me differently after that. Not gratitude, more like reluctant respect. Later, during a command post exercise in California, I sat in the hum of a tent, thick with shouting officers and static-filled radios. Reports contradicted one another, tempers flared. I traced patterns on a map, checked feeds, and pieced together the truth. The enemy was baiting us into a kill zone. I scribbled a note and handed it to the operations major. He barked the new order as if it had been his discovery, and the room calmed. No one mentioned my name. I didn't need them to. I knew what I had done. Grandpa always noticed the things others didn't. Weeks before he passed, when his breathing had grown shallow and his hands shook, he asked me to sit with him at the dining table. "Help me go through these," he said, sliding a stack of folders across the wood. Inside were his service documents, his discharge papers, medal citations, letters from men he'd once commanded. He wanted me to scan them, preserve them, and make sure the record was whole. "You're thorough," he told me, his eyes clear even in his frailty. "Thoroughness wins battles. Not shouting, not swagger, records." I nodded, tucking the words away like another piece of quiet armor. When the call came from his attorney, a retired JAG officer now practicing civilian law, it startled me. "He left one letter," the attorney said, his voice steady. "It's addressed to you, and his instructions were explicit. It must be read aloud, in front of family and any attending service members." The weight of that sank in as I held the phone. My brother would not take it well. Marcus saw me as the family errand runner, not the one trusted with legacy. He'd dismiss it, maybe even laugh in my face. But Grandpa hadn't chosen Marcus. He had chosen me. At the memorial planning meeting, Marcus made a show of telling stories about firefights, about carrying gear across mountains, about his promotions. When I tried to mention the letter, he cut me off. "Don't worry about the important stuff, just set up the chairs. Coffee earns too, if you can manage it." The room chuckled with him. I stayed quiet, my jaw clenched, my mind already rehearsing the moment that was coming. The more Marcus mocked me, the more I remembered Grandpa's words. "When noise wins the room, let documents win the day." My brother had the noise. I had the document. And though I didn't yet know what the letter contained, I knew it would be precise, deliberate, and impossible to laugh off. The stage was being set, even if no one else could see it. The day of the memorial arrived with a kind of heavy stillness. The morning service at the base chapel had been dignified. Rifle salute, folded flag, taps played softly by a bugler in white gloves. But it was the reception afterward that I dreaded. We gathered in the VFW hall, its walls lined with framed photos of long-gone units, a faint smell of coffee and floor polish lingering in the air. Round tables were dressed with white cloths, dotted with centerpieces of carnations that already looked tired in the fluorescent light. I helped set up the urns of coffee and trays of sandwiches, the kind of quiet work no one noticed unless it went wrong. When I carried the last stack of plates to the serving table, I caught Marcus watching me from across the room. He smirked like he'd already won a contest I hadn't agreed to enter. The conversation hummed low at first, neighbors murmuring about Grandpa's war years, Marines sharing fragments of deployments, but it all shifted when Marcus raised his voice. He stood near the display table where Grandpa's shadow box rested, medals glinting beneath the glass, the folded flag laid out with exact precision. He tapped the case with his knuckle, sharp enough to cut through the chatter. "You know," he said loudly, making sure the entire room heard, "Grandpa carried men out of fire. He was a real Marine. Not everyone here can say the same." His eyes flicked toward me, holding just long enough to make his meaning clear. A ripple of awkward silence passed through the guests. I tried to keep my expression neutral, the way I'd been trained in briefing rooms, but he wasn't finished. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping low enough that only those nearest could hear, though I could see half a dozen heads turn. "You're worthless. Always were. Grandpa knew it. Everybody knows it." The words landed like a strike, not to my body but to the space I'd tried so carefully to carve for myself. Worthless. He'd said it before, but never here. Not in front of our family, not in front of Marines who wore the same uniform I did. I felt the weight of eyes on me, some wide with discomfort, others lowered to avoid choosing sides. No one moved. My father's face was a mask of impassive stone, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the floor tiles. An aunt shifted uneasily, opening her mouth before closing it again. An older Marine cleared his throat but said nothing. Even the attorney, standing near the corner with a leather briefcase, stayed silent. The absence of defense was louder than Marcus's insult. In that frozen moment, I felt myself become an island again, just as I had in childhood, surrounded by people, yet entirely alone. My jaw clenched, not from shame but from the realization that they would let his words stand unless I answered. And then a different voice cut through the stillness. Calm, professional, carrying the cadence of someone used to courtrooms. "There is in fact one matter of record that must be addressed," the attorney said, stepping forward. His tone wasn't emotional, it was procedural. Every head turned toward him, grateful perhaps for the interruption.
He opened his briefcase and withdrew a heavy envelope, its wax seal unbroken, and placed it on the table beside the shadow box. Per Sergeant Major Alvarez's written instructions, this letter is to be opened and read aloud by Captain Juarez, today in the presence of family and fellow service members. A murmur swept through the hall. I felt Marcus stiffen beside me. His smirk faltered, just a flicker, but enough. I looked down at the envelope. The seal bore Grandpa's initials, pressed firm and precise. Next to it, the attorney laid the pocket watch, its steady tick audible even in the hush that had fallen. I understood then that this was the moment Grandpa had prepared me for. The insult still hung in the air, but so did the remedy. When noise wins the room, let documents win the day. I reached for the envelope. The envelope felt heavier than paper had any right to be. My fingers traced the edge of the wax seal, the ridges pressed deep, deliberate, final. Around me the room held its breath. Even the coffee urn hissed quieter, as if it too was waiting. Marcus folded his arms across his chest, his posture a sneer in itself. I broke the seal. The sound soft, brittle, like a twig snapping carried through the silence. I unfolded the letter slowly. The paper was thick, yellowed at the edges, Grandpa's familiar block handwriting running in straight, uncompromising lines. I read aloud. My voice was steady, though my hands trembled slightly. To my granddaughter, Captain Juarez, you never needed my words because you already had my trust. Still, words matter and records endure. A ripple moved through the crowd. I glanced up. Marcus's jaw tightened. You once guided a lost platoon by the stars when their compass failed. I heard about it, not from you, but from a sergeant who told me. She saved our knees and our pride that night. That is a record worth more than any medal. I paused. I hadn't known Grandpa had heard about that exercise, let alone remembered it. My eyes scanned the room. A few older Marines exchanged quiet looks. You proofread my letters to families of the fallen. You corrected my words so they gave comfort without error. A small thing to most, but I knew better. Those letters mattered more than speeches. Precision is a form of respect. You carried that respect. The words rang in my chest, sharper than Marcus's insult had ever been. Grandpa hadn't just seen me. He had kept a ledger of my quiet victories. Therefore, I appoint you custodian of my effects. My journals, medals, and the watch that has kept my time longer than my heart has. They are not decorations, they are records. Guard them as you have guarded truth. The attorney cleared his throat, stepping forward with professional calm. The will confirms, Captain Juarez is executor for military memorabilia and related trusts. These items are hers to archive, loan, or display as she sees fit. He tapped the bottom of the page with his pen. The remainder of the estate is divided fairly, but these instructions are explicit. The letter continued. Marcus, my grandson, you carry strength in your arms, but strength is not noise. Respect must be given before it can be received. Do not mistake rank for character. In this family, character is the only rank that matters. A faint murmur passed through the hall. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his bravado slipping, the flush creeping up his neck. Finally, I read, if any heir contests this arrangement, they forfeit their portion. That is my command. Consider it my last order as your sergeant major. I lowered the paper. The room was silent, but for the ticking of the pocket watch on the table. Tick, 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 each beat a gavel strike. Marcus stepped forward, his hand half raised as if to snatch the letter. The attorney's voice cut clean and formal. Touch that, sergeant, and you tamper with evidence. Chain of custody applies here. Marcus froze. His eyes darted to the faces in the room, searching for support, but he found none. An older Marine in dress blues shook his head once, slow and firm. A Lieutenant Colonel Guest shifted his weight and said evenly, that's proper, let it stand. I folded the letter carefully, my voice calm. Grandpa spoke. The record is clear, and in that instant, the weight shifted. My brother's insult dissolved into the air, powerless against ink on paper. The man who had called me worthless now stood stripped of his noise, staring at the quiet authority of a letter he could not undo. The document had spoken louder than him, and the room believed it. For a long beat, no one said anything. The letter lay folded on the table, its presence heavier than any voice. The pocket watch ticked steadily beside it, each sound a reminder that this moment wasn't theater, it was record. Then the murmurs began. Low, careful, the way Marines speak when they've just witnessed a breach of discipline. Two older sergeants, both in pressed blazers with unit pins, came to stand near me. One leaned slightly closer, his voice just above a whisper. Sergeant Major always saw the ones who carried quiet. He gave a small nod, then stepped back, his respect measured but unmistakable. Marcus shifted from foot to foot. The color had drained from his face. He opened his mouth to argue, but the attorney spoke first, his tone clipped and formal. The Sergeant Major established a scholarship trust, funded by his TSP and insurance. Captain Juarez, as executor, will chair the committee with the Veterans Service Office. First-generation service members will have priority. He glanced at Marcus briefly. This was his signed directive, notarized and witnessed. The words hit harder than any rebuke I could have delivered. It wasn't just medals or journals. It was a legacy of service handed to me, with institutional oversight. The attorney wasn't emotional. He was procedural, and that made his authority ironclad. Marcus tried to recover. He meant for me to have his medals. I was the one who... The attorney cut in smoothly, like a judge delivering a ruling. He wrote, "Otherwise, Sergeant," in his own hand, dated, "Witnessed. That is the record." My father stepped forward, his face purple with controlled anger. "Let's not make a scene," he muttered, as though the scene hadn't already been made by his son's insult. His voice carried the same old priority: optics first, truth second. But this time, no one nodded along. The weight of the letter had stripped the stage bare. I could see Marcus wrestling with the trap he'd walked into. Contest the will, and the no contest clause would strip his share entirely. Stay silent, and he lived under the knowledge that Grandpa had chosen me for the things Marcus dismissed. His arrogance was cornered by ink and law. He looked around the room, desperate for allies. But the other Marines, men and women who had carried packs and rifles across deserts and jungles, weren't with him. They weren't with me either. Not personally. They were with the record. In their world, the document wins. And the document was against him. The silence that followed wasn't awkward anymore. It was deliberate. It was the sound of a room adjusting, of postures shifting, of people recalibrating how they saw me. No applause, no dramatic cheers, just a quiet change in gravity. The attorney closed his briefcase, then turned to me. "Captain, we'll need to document the opening of the letter. Note the time and date." I pulled the memorial program card from my pocket, wrote 1447 hours, envelope opened and read, and signed my initials. Grandpa had taught me that habit, recording times and margins, because precision mattered. Even now, with him gone, I carried his method forward. Marcus muttered something under his breath, but it didn't matter. The letter had spoken. The trust was set. The medals, journals, and watch were already mine in the eyes of the law, and the scholarship would bear my hand as chair. As people drifted back to their tables, the mood shifted from tension to subdued conversation. No one congratulated me. They didn't need to. Respect isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the way someone straightens their posture when you walk past. When I stepped outside for air, the late afternoon sun hit the flag out front. The same flag they had folded over Grandpa's casket that morning. It stirred gently in the breeze, sharp against the blue, and for the first time, I felt not like the errand runner of the family, but like the rightful custodian of a legacy. In the weeks after the memorial, the noise around Marcus's outburst faded. People stopped talking about the insult. They talked about the letter. Not in public, not in gossip, but in measured tones at the VFW, or in side conversations after drill. "Sergeant Major left her the journals," they'd say, or "She's the one running the scholarship now." My brother hated it, but he couldn't change it. Grandpa's words had locked the record. At home, I took on the task Grandpa had given me. His desk still smelled faintly of tobacco and old wood polish. I spread out the journals, each one bound in worn green canvas, and cataloged them page by page. Patrol routes, weather notes, casualty counts written in his steady hand. I scanned the entries, labeled files, cross-checked dates. It felt less like inheritance and more like duty. The medals came next. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Good Conduct. I logged them, photographed them, and placed them carefully in acid-free cases. A pocket watch ticked softly beside me, its weight a steady reminder that I was now the steward of his time. A month later, I met with the local military museum. The director, a retired colonel with a handshake that still carried command presence, leaned over the table as I laid out Grandpa's logbooks. "We'll put them on loan," I told him, "but only with accurate captions. Unit, date, citation. No dramatizing." He gave me a long look, then nodded. Sergeant Major would approve. The scholarship launched quietly, just as Grandpa would have wanted. I sat in a modest conference room with a VSO representative and a school counselor, reviewing applications. Some were typed neatly, others handwritten in careful script. A corporal's widow applied for her daughter, a first-generation college student. A young man from a farming town attached his JROTC commendation letter. Reading through them, I realized what Grandpa had done. He hadn't just left me responsibility, he'd left me a bridge for others. One evening, an email arrived in my inbox. It was from a corporal's widow I didn't know. She wrote that years ago, one of the condolence letters Grandpa had sent her family had been so precise, so merciful that she carried it folded in her Bible. She thanked me for proofreading those letters, for caring about commas and clarity. "Because of you," she wrote, "his words were sharp enough to pierce grief, but soft enough to help us heal. Don't underestimate that." I sat there, the glow of the screen on my face, tears I hadn't expected sliding down my cheeks. For the first time, I understood why Grandpa had trusted me. Meanwhile, my family's posture toward me shifted in small, telling ways. My father no longer barked commands when we spoke. Instead, he kept his tone clipped, professional, like addressing a peer he didn't particularly like but had to respect. My mother sent me clipped texts, logistics, updates, but avoided warmth. And Marcus, he vacillated. Some days he sent half-hearted messages, cloaked apologies like, "Guess you got what you wanted." Other days he bristled with resentment. I never engaged. My only reply, if I replied at all, was, "For estate matters, contact counsel."
I didn't need their approval anymore. The flag folded neatly in its case on my mantle, the journal stacked in my study, the ticking watch on my desk. Those were the symbols of recognition I had earned, not through noise but through diligence. As the first batch of scholarship applications closed, I looked at the growing stack of hopeful names. Legacy wasn't about who shouted the loudest in a crowded room. It was about who carried the record forward, who ensured the right people were seen, even when no one else was watching. Marcus could keep his noise. I had the documents, and the documents would outlast him. When I look back on that day, the word worthless still echoes, not because it was true, it never was, but because it revealed how fragile some people's power really is. My brother's authority ended the moment paper met ink, the moment Grandpa's words were read into the record. What struck me most wasn't the insult, it was the silence. For years, silence had felt like isolation. When I was a child with books hidden under my mattress, when I navigated by the stars while others doubted me, when I proofread letters no one thought mattered, silence used to mean invisibility. But that day silence changed. It became something else. It became respect. Grandpa knew the truth all along. Real strength isn't in who talks the loudest, or who demands the spotlight. Real strength is in stewardship, guarding records, honoring details, keeping faith with the things others overlook. He left me his journals, his medals, and his watch not because I was the strongest, but because I was the one who would carry them without turning them into trophies. I think about Marcus often, not with bitterness, but with clarity. He believed muscles and bravado were the only currencies of worth. But Grandpa left him something more valuable, a lesson written in silence, one I don't know if he'll ever absorb. Respect isn't earned by volume, it's earned by consistency, by carrying weight quietly, and without complaint. I also think about the scholarship. The first time I handed out an award letter to a young recruit's family, I felt something click into place. The legacy wasn't about my brother's taunts, or even my own vindication. It was about extending the sergeant major's hand to the next generation, making sure quiet competence had a chance to grow in others. That's the truth I carry with me now. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Dignity doesn't expire. And authority, the kind that lasts, is born not of arrogance, but of competence, documented and steady. So if you've ever been called worthless, remember, words fade, records endure, and sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one carrying the heaviest load. Have you ever seen someone underestimated until they proved everyone wrong? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your story. And if this one resonated with you, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss tomorrow's story. Share it with someone who keeps their head down and gets the work done. They deserve to hear it. We post a new story every day here on Echoes of Revenge, where dignity, discipline, and quiet strength are never forgotten. Grandpa didn't leave me a throne. He left me a ledger. Names, dates, and promises carried forward in silence. That ledger turned my brother's insult into dust, and it reminded me that quiet strength always outlasts noise. Have you ever seen someone underestimated until the truth finally came out? Share your story in the comments. I read every one. If this story spoke to you, hit the like button, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss tomorrow's upload. Share it with someone who knows what it feels like to carry the weight quietly. They deserve to hear this too. Here on Echoes of Revenge, we post a new story every day. Stories of dignity, discipline, and hidden strength. I'll see you in the next one.